Why, hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Rakakis, and today, and we'll also, as always, I've got on here with me, I've
Michael
got.
Thiemann, hello, welcome. And today we have a group of wonderful people with us. We have Leticia Madureira, Skylar Gering, and
Yeah.
Firoozeh Dastur. And today we have something that is very dear to my heart. We will talk about the Julia gender inclusive, but also the diversity, equity, and inclusiveness efforts at JuliaCon. So hello.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, hello. I'm super happy to be here.
Yeah, I mean, so before we dive into all that, though, we've never had this many guests on before. How are we going to introduce all of you? Are we going to rapid fire introduce one by one by one?
We can
Yeah,
do
let's
it.
do it.
Yeah.
All right, Leticia, let's go. Rapid fire. Who are you in
Okay.
a nutshell?
Oh, okay. So I'm Leticia. I'm from Brazil. I'm a chemist, and I moved to the US in 2022 to do my PhD in chemistry. So currently, I'm studying at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, doing computational quantum chemistry work in catalysis and method development and coding in Julia.
Yeah, fantastic. I can hop in. So I'm Skylar. I originally studied computer science and math in Southern California at Harvey Mudd College, and after graduating, I became a research software engineer at Caltech. And my whole big thing was always studying the climate modeling. And while at Caltech, I got into modeling the sea ice, and that's where I started using Julia. And I recently started my PhD at the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute joint program, where I'm actually looking into wind farm modeling. So moving into climate solutions.
Cool. And Firoozeh?
Hi, so I'm currently a PhD student. Well, I should start with a background maybe. I come from Pakistan and currently I'm based in Germany in a small town called Kaiserslautern. And I came across Julia during my PhD, and then I delved into a little bit of distributed computing. And last JuliaCon, I actually presented my hobby project at JuliaCon. And since you guys are so welcoming, I try to, sorry, now I'm losing my voice. You guys are so welcoming. I try to get into all the events possible. And I am planning on contributing more to the distributing computer side of Julia because I find there are not enough easy interfaces for people who are not HPC experts.
That is definitely true. That
Let's
sounds
go.
very cool. And something that's also very important to us is that we want to hear more about each of those topics later, but I think they all deserve individual episodes. So this was just a quick teaser. Before we dive more into the main topic for today, is something that is also very important to me is how did you come to programming? How did you come to Julia specifically? Because this is a Julia podcast.
Skylar, you can go first.
Oh, okay. We've fully lost Chris.
Oh my goodness.
That's okay. Yeah, so I actually came to Julia through no choice of my own, although I'm glad it happened. But when I started my job at Caltech, it had sort of been pre-decided that the work we were going to be doing was going to be in Julia, and basically that was porting and improving a sea ice model that was originally written in MATLAB and moving it into Julia for increased speed, and so we could eventually couple it with an existing Julia Ocean model called Oceananigans. And so I didn't have a lot of say in that, but I really quickly fell in love with the language, especially for its ease of setting up different simulation setups and different types of models. And it was just something that was so much easier than I could have imagined doing in any other language and brought us a lot of speed ups. And through that, I sort of entered into the community by going to JuliaCon 2023 and then JuliaCon 2024 and sort of got more into the community that way.
So I guess I can tell my story now. So I started programming in around 2017 in Fortran. and Python, because in my field, which is computational quantum chemistry, a lot of the software is written in Fortran and C++. So I started by learning those languages, and it was a rough journey at the beginning because it's always rough. You're trying to learn a new thing, a new language, and at the same time, you're trying to learn it and apply it to a very narrow and specific field, which is computational quantum chemistry. So you have to understand what kinds of algorithms and calculations you need to implement. So yeah, this was the beginning of my journey. And with Julia, I started coding with Julia in 2019 when I started working on my undergrad thesis. So it was like halfway through my undergrad studies. And I started developing very simple models in computational quantum chemistry, like extended Hickel and other semi-empirical methods, which have a lot of approximations to calculate electronic energies and interelectronic interactions in molecules. And then as time passed, I started some initiatives to teach Julia to others, not only in my research group in undergrad, but also like for other people in Latin America. So I started teaching Julia to chemists around 2020, and then I started my own YouTube channel with videos teaching Julia. And introduction to Julia and some cool features that I found interesting when I was learning it. And since then, I still use Julia to develop quantum chemistry software, but also to teach and try to make programming a more fun and easier journey to everyone that wants to join. Because in chemistry, I believe that we need to teach chemists to code, even if they don't do theory and computation for a living, but they always need to process data from experiments. So as many chemists know how to code, the better, because it's always useful and important. So I want to make it less scary and less intimidating to them. And also develop better algorithms for my field. And we can go into more details if we have a specific episode about it. But there are a lot of interesting things about quantum chemistry algorithms because they are very expensive in terms of in time consuming. So Julia can help speeding up those calculations, and that's what I have been advocating for in my field since then. So yeah.
Cool. And Firouzeh.
Yeah, so I will start with how I got into programming. I actually, during my high school, I did a computer science major. And back in the day, I was programming with DOS. But then I decided I decided computer science was not for me. So I jumped off and I went to mathematics, and since then I've been indulged in theoretical mathematics, and currently I'm a tropical and algebraic geometer. But during my master's, I realized that, okay, no matter how far I try to run away from programming, it's not running away from me. During my master's, I had to write some library for my master thesis. It was in a different language, not exactly Julia, very C syntax styled, very I would say unpleasant. And then during my PhD, the first year, it was a bumpy start of my PhD, and I had to learn completely new language. Julia was the choice, not by myself, but I was pushed into it, as Skylar also said. Back then, I regretted it. I didn't like it at all. My love for Julia is very recent. After meeting the larger community of Julia. Yeah, but yeah, I implemented a bunch of things for my PhD thesis. I'm still working on it, but then I also worked at a research. I'm currently still working at a research institute which works with HPC tooling, And the computations I require for my research are so large that they can't be done sequentially, which is why I needed something that can do distributed computing. And when I learned how that thing is supposed to be used, first of all, it's not done in one language. I have to learn a bunch of XML, C++, CMake, Bash scripting. And I was like, okay, after doing all of this, can I reuse at least the skeleton of it for a different application which has the same structure? Just the code is changing. And the answer was no, you have to rewrite everything.
Oh my goodness.
I was like, yeah, that doesn't sound, because I still look at myself as a theoretical mathematician. I want to focus on my research, not on the tooling. And that's where I sat together with a collaborator and we developed this package for Julia. And Julia has really nice ways of integrating. Initially, it was a struggle to integrate C++ code into Julia, but once we got the hang of it, from there on, everything I wrote in Julia was very smooth. And I'm planning on adding more nice features, which makes it even more convenient to use. And yes, I tell my collaborator is a computer scientist and a HPC expert. He thinks I'm interested in HPC. I'm more interested in making my life and the mathematician's life more easy. I'm like, yeah, in HPC, I understand. I need to understand what's happening behind the curtain. Not everyone needs to know that. If you're spending most of your energy understanding the tooling, it's pointless. And Julia is very nice in terms of providing you that nice curtain where you can still peek behind it, but you don't necessarily have to.
Yeah, I think that there really is something really nice about that modularity, and like the specialization in what everyone does, right? Like I think that one of the things that you kind of especially in grad school, right? You always start to at first meet a lot of this purism that's just like, oh, you will never be a true XYZ unless you do everything in C from scratch, and if you haven't built your own supercomputer, you'll never know how to get the most perform like you get all the, and then but then you just start to feel like, okay, what do I really need? What do I really need, right? When you really start to get down into it, right? You just go, I don't really worry about this as much. Don't worry about this as much. And maybe this is the world that works for me, right? And it sounds like Julie kind of fit into a nice spot for you there.
So I had a very strong critic of why I shouldn't be using Julia and why everyone needs to understand this basic functionality of it, and you need to know how it's parsed and compiled. And I came up with a very good analogy. I'm very proud of myself for that. I told that guy, like, so you're telling me if I ever want to extend my screen and I want to purchase a new screen, I need to first understand how screens are made, how the chips are made, how the wiring is done. And I have to bring all of that stuff home, put everything together, and only then I'm allowed to extend the screen. And he looked at it and was like, yeah, but that's different. I'm like, how? This is the same thing. I need something to work for me, and this is not working for me. If I have an easy interface like Julia that's handling all the dirty work for me, I'll be very happy.
And
yeah. But I have to say, in my group, people who didn't like Julia as much are now coming around.
And
they always come around sooner or later. You just got to bug them long enough.
I also like this perspective of, okay, it was not love on first sight, because many people that we had in the past started to appreciate Julia very easily. But it also, I think, speaks in particular to the qualities of the community, that it is an environment where people feel encouraged to just come and be and get help and continue to get help, even if they might not be ever the biggest fans, or maybe someday you'll be the biggest fan, I don't know, but still you are here and you want to come back and you want to contribute, and I think that is great. The reason why we have this group here today is because we want to talk about the Julia Gender Inclusive Initiative, and also in more general about the diversity and equity and inclusiveness initiatives happening in Julia. So for those who might never have heard about it, what is the Julia Gender Inclusive Initiative? Who is it for? And what are the things that you are doing?
Skylar, do you want to start and then I go to the
Sure.
initiatives? Go ahead.
That sounds good. Yeah, so the big idea is, and I guess if you've ever been to a JuliaCon, maybe one of the first things that will strike you is it's not the most diverse of places. And that's certainly what struck me, my first sort of experience with the wider Julia community off of the Slack, at least, was JuliaCon 2023. And I think I've been very lucky in the computer science environments that I was like raised in, trained in that it's always been near a 50-50 ratio of men and women. And so coming definitely to JuliaCon 2023 was a shocker. And so that's sort of what got me into working on Julia gender inclusive and Julia diversity in general. And Leticia and I actually met at JuliaCon 2023 at
Yeah.
one of the Birds of a Feather events run by Julia Gender Inclusive. And you were actually running part of that
Yeah,
event.
I was. We have our yearly Birds of a Feather that the Julia Gender Inclusive hosts at the JuliaCon, and I was running it back in 2023, and I met Skylar there. And one thing I clearly remember this because Skylar was like, "Oh, I wanted to go to other talks." But I think this Birds of a Feather is really important, and everything is happening at the same time. We should have a dedicated track for this. And then, like, out of this, I don't know, discomfort, or maybe out of this idea, Skylar got involved into the Julia Gender Inclusive and the DEI efforts at the JuliaCon.
Yeah.
Um,
But
and yeah, go ahead.
yeah, basically, Julia Gender Inclusive is a group to bring together people who identify as women or people who are sort of. So
Go ahead.
basically, yeah, Julia Gender Inclusive is a group that's meant to build community for people who feel that their gender is underrepresented in Julia and in open source in general. And so through that, they run a lot of different events, which Leticia can speak more to. And I was also the JuliaCon 2024 diversity co-chair after sort of that experience at JuliaCon 2023. And we worked really, really closely with JGI to build that set of events, which is actually then where I'm at for the next year. And then you've now become super invested in JGI's events that are going on basically 2024, 2025. So we all met through JGI and JuliaCon in some way or another.
Yeah. My story with that JuliaCon, I also have a story. It was my in 2023. It was my first JuliaCon in person, and I was giving a talk on my specific field and research in the quantum track. And I remember that in my talk, I was the only woman in the room, and the room was not like full empty. It was not empty, but I was the only woman in the room. I was like, whoa, wait. I know other people interested in this kind of work, not because it's my work, but the whole track in that afternoon. Um, and I don't see other women or people from different genders here in this track, which is like uh, it's kind of it's not something that you can directly blame on the people that are underrepresented, like, oh, so they are not interested, that's why they don't want to come. No, like, there is something more happening, uh and we can talk more about this. But this was like my experience a day before I was running the Birds of a Feather. So this was an experience that reinforced to me the importance of being part of Julia Gender Inclusive and trying to leverage those efforts to bringing more people to the community and more diverse people to the community. And what we have been doing in Julia Gender Inclusive as our main activities. My first contact was in 2020, back in 2022, I think. The Julia Gender Inclusive invited me to present about my journey with Julia in one of our coffee hours. So we always had this event called Coffee Hour, which is like we have people from underrepresented groups presenting about their journey about some interesting topic in research, in computer science, whatever they want to talk about. And it's a very nice time. We come together, discuss those topics, and we try to make this space as safe, open as possible to welcome everyone. Um, and then since then, I officially joined the Julia Gender Inclusive Organization. And then in 2023, um, beside the Birds of a Feather at the JuliaCon, we also had hackathons that we hosted. So we had people bringing projects and inviting people to collaborate in those projects. We were working on writing documentation and updating the Julia Gender Inclusive webpage, and people working on their individual projects as well. So something to kind of lift up the community and bring people together to work, and feel free to talk about whatever topic they want, and also see some representation of like people that look like them or people that have some affinity with them, uh, and try to build those and try to build friendships, really try to get this set of the Julia community to come together and do something for the Julia language. And we also started having something similar to the coffee hours, but now calling it community hours. So again, having people from underrepresented groups to come and present about something that they might be interested in. And we hope to keep doing those activities and host more events. And I think Firoozeh can talk about like things that we are planning for next year or things that we want to be doing as well.
So one thing I'm kind of curious about here is like how much inspiration did you take from other groups and like other programming languages? Like for example, I know that a lot of people have talked about Our Ladies as being a successful system, right? How much inspiration have you taken from these other groups, and how much have you just kind of said, oh, we're gonna just blaze some new trails, and there's some new things that we really want to be pushing forward here.
Mm, I'm not one of the original members of the Judah Gender Inclusive group, so I can't say for sure how much we take, like how much inspiration we take from these other groups. But I know that whenever we see some activity that a different community did, we all always try to bring it in or like try to make something similar, but that has more of um, that is more suitable for what the Julia community wants. So we, for sure, whenever we see something in the social media, something that is advertised from these other groups, we try to bring it in and we take inspiration from it. But our originality comes from how we can make this look like Julia and how we can make this attract people that are using Julia. So we try to kind of uh, make it as Julia-like possible. And I think Skylar can also talk about like a lot of the DEI work at the JuliaCon. Um, we took a lot of inspiration from Pie Ladies, a lot of those other communities as well, right?
So I think actually one of my favorite things, and maybe we can get into some of the stuff that we ran at JuliaCon in a little bit, but one of my favorite events that we put a lot of time and effort into, and especially worked with Kim Oth, who is one of the more original members of Julia Gender Inclusive as well. But she, I, and Jacob Zelko planned this huge diversity dinner. And basically, a big focal point of that dinner was inviting some guest speakers from these other communities. So we had a speaker from Pie Ladies, a speaker from Our Ladies, and a speaker from Out in Tech, as well as Jacob speaking on behalf of Julia Summer of Code and discussing what sort of events work for their communities. how that might be the same or different as Julia, as well as just the importance of diversity and what drives each of the different groups. And I think that, like Leticia was saying, an important thing to remember is Julia, in its sort of open sourceness, is different from like Python or R, the general user of maybe other languages. And so we do our own thing, but we definitely share, that common goal. And I think that was one of the first times we really had like a joint event with the other groups, and it was such a good time, and I think we all learned a lot from it. And so I think that would be really interesting to see going forward, especially maybe for some more local events.
So I would like to add a little side note to it. So also not as a JGI member, but as someone who was introduced to JGI only during 2024. So I don't know about other programming languages and their gender inclusive groups, but I've been part of these gender inclusive groups for a while now in different fields, my field specifically. I have to say that the Julia gender inclusive group is the first one which seems to work, actually. So they actually listen and they actually try to solve the problem instead of, trying to avoid the conflict and give you a hacky solution to something. So that's something I really appreciated, and which is why I try to get now more involved to learn from you guys to see how we can improve the other gender inclusive groups maybe.
I love this phrasing that you feel that there's a community that actually wants to solve the problems and also listens to what the problems are before they want to solve it, which leads us to the next big question that I have is, what can people like me, right? If you look at me, I'm very much the problem, or the system that is not very representative. Like, how could I help? This was the other thing that I think you wanted to mention before Chris jumped in. Like, what are the things that you plan to do next in order to help each other?
Yeah, I'm happy to offer some perspective on the first one. This is actually a conversation we did have at JuliaCon. And I think that something from my personal experience, and at least a few other folks in JGI, is like taking that leap into Julia, which is sort of like taking that leap into open source, can be made so much easier with just a little bit of encouragement. So someone who feels, and who you may feel as someone who's not as represented in the community, is really a person who's in the community. Someone just looking at your work and being like, yeah, that looks really cool. Why don't you do a pull request? Can make a surprisingly large difference, because you suddenly feel like, oh, maybe I'm in the in group actually. And it sort of breaks down maybe preconceptions that society has given you as you've grown up, as you've moved through the field. And even just like words from people who, as you put it, like are more represented, can make a bigger impact than you might think. And I think even with that, keeping in mind that people you interact with through pull requests and online may not feel as if they're in the community. So when you're giving feedback on pull requests, saying something positive about people's work, being like, wow, that's really cool work. You could improve it through this, feels like mentorship instead of like criticism to someone who may have not had a positive experience in other programming communities. And so I think just something as simple as those two things from personal experience and from conversations makes such a big difference.
Yeah, I agree with Skylar. And one thing that I would like to add is like, whenever people that have like more voice in the community or have more space in the community give space to members of the community that identify themselves as underrepresented to talk, or like to express their perspective, or when you see that someone is being ignored on their pull request, not because whatever, but you can see that there is like a gender issue, prejudice, or whatever, you can always try to step up and, as Skylar said, encourage and interact with those people, and also give space and open up space for different voices to come in and speak, and also have like a participation and offer their point of view, their perspective, their contributions. And I think actually the Julia community is getting better and better at this over time. For example, I program in other languages, but I don't feel like I'm a member of other languages community, but I feel like I'm a member of the Julia community, if that makes sense. Because being part of a community is much more than just like, oh, I program in that language, so I'm part of that community. No, you actively contribute. You talk to other users, to other developers. They listen to you. You exchange. You have this interaction on GitHub. You have projects that other people also contribute. So I think this part of this exchange is the most important part of being a member of a community. And uh, in the Julia community, I feel that, but I don't feel that in other languages, I would say.
Oh, I wanted to say, Firoozeh, did you want to put anything in there? I wanted to make sure that you got a shot as well.
No, not really. I mean, I agree with what Skylar and Leticia said, and yeah, I mean, exactly why I'm still around in working with Julia, because now I'm close to a point where I'll be finishing my PhD, and if I wasn't really feeling like I'm part of the community, I would have already made plans to jump off the ship. But I do start feeling that I'm part of, I'm actually welcomed, and it's not like I'm just a burden there, or I'm just another person people want to avoid talking to because I have too many questions about stuff I don't understand. And I have way too many questions.
Oh, I hope everyone who's watched this podcast has learned that the one thing that developers really like to do is just talk about what they're doing. So feel free, always ask your questions. You're making someone's day when you do that.
Yeah, don't say developers in general, but Julia developers.
Okay, yeah, so not developers in general. Okay.
Yeah.
That's true.
And I guess building on that, like making people part of a community, I think that's what a lot of our efforts with JuliaCon last year were. So we started trying to have sort of like a mentor-mentee program to match up folks so you can meet new people. I think this upcoming year it's going to become more of a buddy-buddy program because it's a little bit challenging, especially in a community that has people who are researchers and developers. You might have someone who is, a senior researcher, but they feel like they're a beginning developer, and someone who's a, senior developer, but maybe a beginning researcher. So calling someone a mentor, someone a mentee in a community as diverse as, in interest and skill level in different ways as we have. Is harder, but everyone can learn something from someone else. So making those connections, I think, is what we're trying to do at JuliaCon. As well as through JGI. And I think also especially something I noticed my first year is because Julia is sort of built from the ground up, a lot of the people who are really the in crowd all know each other and are all like best friends. And that's wonderful. And when you come in, that can be so intimidating. So you're like, wow, I'm not anyone's bestie here yet. Who am I going to talk to? And I think that when you're from an underrepresented group, that level of closeness, no one's trying to keep you out necessarily, but it can be interpreted in a really closed off way that once you're there for a little bit, you kind of realize, oh, actually, that had nothing to do with the fact that I was an underrepresented minority here. It just had everything to do with I started this 1 year ago and people have been here since the beginning. But I think keeping an eye out for bringing new people in to make sure that there isn't a chance for sort of that preconception to even take root is really important.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why with the last JuliaCon, and I think with the next JuliaCon, I'm gonna have to talk with Leticia here because she's actually part of the local community, so she'll know how to actually get this together. For the last JuliaCon, I tried something new, which is just going to karaoke with everyone, right? Because I thought, here's the thing. You laugh about it, but it's just like you take someone who you think is like this, respected professor. You've been reading everything that they're doing, and you go sing Little Mermaid with them, right? And then you'll be completely you'll be able to just finally talk with someone a different. I think there's these little things that I think we need to be doing in the community. Just be like, let's break down these barriers. It's not professor student or senior developer new developer. It's people just getting to know each other, right? And then people helping each other in their journey. And I think that really trying to get it to that level is what we need to do. But it can be hard sometimes. It can be very hard because there are established hierarchies that we are working with, and there's a system, and but doing everything that we can to just make it buddy. I think that system sounds really cool. I might try to sign up to have someone be a buddy. So yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, people.
JuliaCon 2025, here we go.
One thing.
If I may
go ahead.
speak a
Oh, yeah,
little bit on
Firoozeh.
behalf of the people like me who really can't sing even if their life depended on it, please also organize something which is not karaoke based.
All right, we can do
Okay,
something that's also not
I hear
karaoke.
you.
But
Yeah, I hear you. We'll make sure we'll have those activities here in Pittsburgh. We'll make it happen. No, another thing that I was saying, like, of course, as Chris said, we have those hierarchies and this system, but people, at the end of the day, people are just people. They're not their title, their skill set. So we can all interact with each other and come together and have like some fun together and like exchange and have a conversation and establish this buddy relationship.
yeah,
It's just
and
kind of
actually
It
with
helps you
JuliaCon
join
20. But with JuliaCon 2022 or 2023 in MIT, there was a new thing that was started, and I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if Leticia, if we were part of the organizing of that. It was the kind of having set events that people could go to on one of the nights, right? I think that the
yes.
thinking behind it was that if you leave everyone to their own devices, they talk to who they know, and they go to dinner with these other people. But then there was some kind of system that someone put together, which is like, hey, sign up for this, and we'll get dinner groups, and you'll just go out with someone, right? If you want to talk
Social
more about that,
activities.
I
Absolutely.
completely forgot about it, but it was such a cool idea, and I think it worked out well. I think that I met more people in that JuliaCon through anything else.
Absolutely. We can chat more about that, and like I'm happy to take ideas and bring to the local committee as well for the next JuliaCon.
We'll talk about we are talking about inclusiveness, and we're desperately trying to include Chris with his technical difficulties today, so it's very
Yes.
fitting.
That's right.
It's
You don't
very
need to try to
appropriate.
include me. I'm loud, and I apologize beforehand for anyone that I just kind of talk right through. Just hit the mute button on me.
What I heard already is a little bit of that spirit that I think everyone here seems to share, that going to JuliaCon was a more positive experience than other conventions, let's say, where the expectations were exceeded at JuliaCon for all of us. I think this is what I heard to some extent. Okay, you're Skylar. Let me.
I think it was a mixed bag, and that's sort of why I ended
Okay.
up being, I think, the DEI chair for JuliaCon 2024. And I think that's because the first half of my conference, before the birds of a feather, and then before I met a couple of other folks who sort of took me under their wing, felt really isolating. From like, I speak from experience with the feeling not in the in crowd and not figuring out why I couldn't find people to talk to before sort of being new to the community, before sort of realizing how just the community naturally formed sort of contributes to a lot of that. And in the end, it was a really positive experience and led me to joining the committee for last year. And so overall, I would characterize it as that. But I do think that the first half led to the wonderful second half and led to my, involvement in the community. But it was that rough patch that led to the greater involvement.
Yeah, that's right. And I also recall that Leticia, I totally butchered your experience of giving a talk and seeing no one from your gender also is definitely not exceeding expectations.
No, but I was in the same situation in other conferences as well. This was not just a JuliaCon thing, because and in my field, which is more theory, math, computation in chemistry, it's a very restricted field by itself because not a lot of people in chemistry do theory and computation, and not a lot of women will do that. So in my research groups, in my undergrad research group and in my PhD research group, I'm the only woman. And my PIs are very supportive. Like my PI in my undergrad was supportive, and my PI now is supportive, and like always welcoming of diverse people, of course. But the group ended up being like not very diverse for plenty of reasons. So I see myself on that situation like all the time. I go to conference. Oh, okay, so 80% of the room is male, and or like sometimes I'm the only woman there. So it's kind of like I got used to these dynamics, but it's still not like, yeah, it's still not what I wanted to see. I wanted to see more diverse people in the audience, because it is intimidating. It ends up being intimidating some level, I would say.
I loved the vocabulary that I picked up today already, like this in crowd and or in group and not being in group, or also that you perceive the Julia community as mostly open source community, and so having these experiences and situations also mostly relate through the lens of open source in this context, was something that I was totally unaware of so far. So I think in the past, how I thought about this was, okay, the IT scene can be very programmers and tech bros, and I mean, that is a toxic culture in my opinion, um, as is a non-starter. But Julia was not that culture. But I thought about it. Okay, it might be like academia also is not as in particular if you go to pursue a PhD, and the higher you get in academia, the more less diverse it gets, or the less diverse it gets. So, like, how do you perceive this as the people suffering from this? Like, is it like the tech bros? Is it academia? Is it open source? Is it?
I think there's a mixture. So I think that, in my opinion, as someone who's in academia and I guess in this open source community, the problem is always like people who aren't as welcoming, or people who don't want to see you succeed. But I think in
Mm-hmm.
academia, like Leticia said, if you have a supportive and protective supervisor, or if you have a supportive group, you're sort of able to get to a point where you refine your work within your bubble, and you have this sphere where you're like safer of sharing your ideas. But with open source, right, you're just like, well, rough draft number one, throw it to the crowd. And you don't necessarily know, who is that crowd? Are they going to be supportive of your work, of your developments? And so I think that maybe that can contribute to more of a sense of unease and less willingness to start, which is where that encouragement can come in that I brought up earlier, sort of making it apparent that faceless GitHub crowd you may be throwing your pride and joy to is gonna really help you along instead of hurt you. I think that's the difference I perceive between academia and open source.
Yeah.
So if I may add to that, I think one thing that I noticed, which is so far I've only noticed in the Julia community, is it's all of the things that you mentioned, Mikhail, but it's also people who see the toxicity are not toxic but don't say anything about it. So because we are an open source community, I'm also very aware that some of us are more active in responding to pull requests and suggestions, giving suggestions. And at some point it gets old because you come across the same questions over and over again, but the people who are asking are not the same. So for example, if I'm answering the same question over and over again, I might get tired. and
Mm-hmm.
might, change my tone at some point. But if someone like Skylar or Leticia or you are watching me and you are like, hey, that wasn't, we understand you might be not in a good mood or tired, but that wasn't the way to respond. And then I would also reflect that, okay, yeah, it was uncalled for and I shouldn't have replied to that. So you're also at the same time correcting me and encouraging the person who asked the question, who got the rude response or who got a response that was not expected. So they also feel like if one person is somewhat behaving unexpectedly, or rather expectedly, because we perceive programming fields, at least from the part of the world I come from, it's considered as a very exclusive group. So if someone is coming with that perception, and then you see someone who's already trying to be a mediator and talking on both sides and calming, diffusing the situation, let's say that,
Mm-hmm.
it's also sort of welcoming.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a very interesting thought that I've had about that topic before, because one of the things that has come up before was I had someone mention to me, I think it was just on like a Hacker News thread or something. They're just like, oh, you never want to talk to anyone about this topic, right? And I was just like, wait, what? Like, what did I say that? And then they're like, oh, look at this post from this. And so what I realized is that, yeah, when you're building these online communities, because there's just this like long history of everything that you said, and there's thousands of messages. You can do thousands of these messages every single day. Yeah, it's really helpful to kind of have someone kind of say, hey, look, this wasn't you on your best behavior. You might want to go back and make a comment on that one, right? Because that sits there forever, and people will see what who we are as a community, what we're doing, who we're welcoming and who we're not welcoming, based off of a message from 10 years ago, right? And it's crazy to think, but I've had a post that just said like, oh, you never want to talk to someone about whether they can do this ONOD thing. Yeah, they gave a comment that I gave, and I was like, oh, I didn't necessarily mean that. I don't know what I said that, but like, yeah. Well, I think I was just saying like, yeah, I'm not doing this today because it's like Christmas Day or something, right? But like it's how it's read, right? You have to have someone to say, hey, look, here's how I'm reading this, and hey, we should correct ourselves. And so I think that's a very good point, because it doesn't kind of come up that often, because the people who would read that kind of a post and be like, oh, I think that they're always never want to talk with an undergrad or something, like those people will just never mention it because they'll go away, right? And so I think that if you do see something that needs to be corrected, like we be helpful, be vocal about it, because I think most of the people have good intentions, but when you're writing thousands and thousands of messages every single day, over a span of a decade, there will be some that are not coming off as you intended. And I think that we have to all help each other to build, to be the right community means that we have to have the right words out there for the whole record of it. So I think that there's a very interesting point to be made there.
No. And the words that still echo in my ear is this: you throw your pride and joy to the world, and then something that you value into the judgment of people that you don't know, and then it totally depends on how the other person reads it in the moment, what the other person's mood is in the moment, and then how that message is then perceived by you when you then log back into also plays a huge part in it. And I can see that is a challenging environment in the best of times, and it can be quickly very it just needs constant effort to make sure that it stays very positive. And this is something that I will definitely take away from this. Yeah.
I think that ties into sort of what you brought up with the programmer culture. Like, if you think about someone who may have come from a community where that sort of behavior is more prevalent, taking the risk then in a new community like Julia, even though it is, a really welcoming and supportive community on the whole, the stakes can feel heightened. And so I think just being aware of, if you are underrepresented in tech, or interacting with people who are underrepresented in the open source community, they may have these really negative background experiences that they have sort of pushed through to remain in a field that they really care about. And so, I think that maybe people who haven't had those experiences are like, okay, yeah, but this is exactly how I respond to everyone. But, not everyone is coming from the same background. And,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the programmer stereotype is like people have been programming since they're like 12 and then they get to college and they're already like whizzes at it. And, it's frustrating to then for people who are, that skilled at that time to interact with people who maybe are just getting started. But you're not always just getting started because you didn't care earlier. It might not be something you were exposed to when you were younger, something that you had the opportunity to access wherever you received your education until maybe you get to college or maybe later. And so remaining cognizant that just because someone didn't start as earlier might not currently be as skilled doesn't mean that they don't have the potential to be really amazing. It just means that maybe they weren't raised the same or didn't have access to the same resources as you did. And so making sure that we don't necessarily judge people by the programmer they are right now, but being really cognizant of those things that hold back, through no fault of their own, people who are underrepresented in tech.
Yeah. And just to add one thing, in some of the Birds of a Feather that we hosted at the JuliaCon, we've heard stories about people that asked questions in discourse and or tried to approach people on Slack or tried to like vocalize their questions, and sometimes they feel because of the way it's answered or because of the way other people approach those questions, they feel dissuaded to like keep trying and keep moving. So this is something that sometimes can be harming to the learning process of new users and new developers, and may dissuade people from actually trying and improving and doing more. So always trying to be as constructive as possible when like pointing out things to people is also something that could try to make the whole environment more welcoming.
Yeah, I actually unfortunately, I come from a group like that where I always received responses ranging from, well, you're not a programmer, you won't understand it, or you're trying to solve a homework problem. And then that's why I was very glad that one of the times when I was looking for something on the Julia Slack and I saw Skylar's message, and then I went directly into personal messaging and I messaged her, and after her response I started feeling like, okay, not all maybe Julia factored groups are the same, and the general group might be much more inclusive. But usually I've also noticed most non-programmers or non-computer scientists who start with Julia usually start with their own small group on Slack or on some other network, and then they may or may not even know about the general Julia group.
True. I will not tell you the number of Julia people who I'm like, are you on the Slack? And they're like, what? And basically every scientist in Julia that I meet who's, a new user, just trying it out for their work, they never know about the general Slack, which I think for me was something that seeing how many questions are asked and answered was really comforting, and gave me the courage to toss some of my questions out to the Slack.
Yeah, I always find that interesting too, because people are like, yeah, I'm starting to try this new small little programming language. It's called Julia. I'm like, oh yeah, join the Slack. There's 15,000 people, and they're like, whoa, okay, that's no longer small. But I think one of the things that I've kind of brought up here, which I think is kind of like an interesting point around this, is that, especially with open source communities, there's kind of like some structural issues, right? And I think that's one of the things that kind of makes the topic kind of difficult for a lot of people, right? Because I think, when you start to talk about it, it's just like, oh, did I do something wrong? Do I know something and there are obviously some bad actors. Like there's always some bad actors. Right, and we've had to ban some people from the Julia community who have been complete bad actors. Different story, right? But for a lot of what's going on in open source, there's structural issues, right? Because especially when we're talking about this community, it's like, okay, who has had the ability to learn a very difficult skill and then suddenly have enough free time, not using it at their work or in their school, or doing it on a project that their advisor told them that would absolutely be terrible, because again, anyone in academia, they are told if you make software, you're going to kill your career, right? You have all these things and still just say, you know what, I'm going to spend all these hours to be contributing to an open source project where I might not even be recognized for it, because, you know, maybe only the first person ever author will ever be recognized, but I just think that I just need to make the software better. And if you do that for like 5 years, suddenly you're in this open source community, and everyone just goes, well, yeah, can't everyone just join into it? And you know, it's just, everyone has a computer. You just make commits on GitHub, right? And so I think that, you know, it is interesting to kind of, you know, that there is a structural kind of impediment to open source contributions that really favors a very specific kind of privileged background to be able to get through, because you have to have the faith that if this doesn't work out for me, I still have a lot of other opportunities, right? And so I think that, you know, it's like it's an interesting thing to bring up, that, you know, like, yeah, a lot of people in the community will start to be like, oh, you know, like, you know, oh, why haven't you been programming for this long? Why didn't you learn C and R and Fortran and everything before you did this? Like, that's the best way to become HPC. I think it's all kind of coupled together in this kind of idea of, you know, like, you know, being able to let people in at any level is kind of what's required to make the open source community be able to have more people in there, because it is, you know, even though anyone could technically join it, it has more impediments, and you see those not in the what it takes to sign up, but you see that in who ends up having, you know, the biggest contributions, right? Because it does require that you have other things around you to build up in order to be able to have the faith I can throw myself into this. So maybe I'll step off that soapbox for a little bit, but, you know, I just thought, you know, because everyone kind of brought it up that, you know, there's a structural issue, and I just seen it so much, and it is a nice thing to kind of just identify that this exists.
I totally agree. And I think it also comes out when you're like, oh, well, how do you, to, you know, someone who runs a library in Julia, like, how do you find new contributors? Like, how are you finding these new people that you mentor? And it's always like, oh, you know, they just showed up. They made a commit. And it's like, yes. And, you know, how did those people get to that point? And what are the roadblocks for getting to that point that you may not be seeing? And, you know, how can we, and it's a really tricky question, right? Because we're not able to just find people randomly, but how can we in Julia build structures, build programs that help find people who could be really, you know, wonderful and talented and welcome in our community, but aren't necessarily the people who are just gonna show up.
So maybe that is the right point to have a question that goes beyond the gender inclusiveness efforts, and that the Julia Gender Inclusive homepage, I think, explicitly states this is for people whose gender is underrepresented in Julia, which also implies that other lack of diversity in Julia is not targeted for this group. But I believe that there is more, like, even more diversity efforts could improve. And Firoozeh, you mentioned you're from a culture and a background that definitely also gives you a double disadvantage, I guess. So I think we already touched a little bit on how we might be possible to lower the burdens a little bit. But what is your take on if there are people out there who feel underrepresented but not of their gender, like a game plan? So what are the
Yeah.
footsteps that they might be following in?
Oh, maybe I can add something to this. Last year, when we were organizing JuliaCon, this was actually a topic, because I was like, oh, okay, we have all this effort in DEI, but we also have to include people with disabilities or people with other backgrounds, right? And we also tried to implement some things in the past JuliaCon to make it to increase the accessibility for people with disabilities. So we're making sure to check the place, to check if there will be if there would be templates for presentations, if all the things will be clear enough that as many people as possible could join and could enjoy the conference without facing any like trouble navigating through it. So this was something that I particularly started like advocating for. And one personal kind of thing that I'm working on is trying to develop tools for people that are visually impaired to make their programming journey easier. So I started developing those myself because I personally I have some visual impairment issues. So I had to establish accommodations for myself in my own setup. So why not make it public and try to help other people? So I'm currently working on this and trying to make like a few packages in Julia to make people's programming journey easier. I know that accessibility is not the only thing that we care about. I think Skylar can also talk about other topics, but this was something that I wanted to add that I am particularly working on.
Important to highlight that accessibility and diversity, are hand in hand and both deserve equal attention. And I think that that's not something that we've looked into as much as a community. And I think with regards to, JGI focusing on gender, when I was running a lot of the diversity efforts last year, that actually broke my heart because someone came up to me for the diversity dinner and was like, if there is someone who feels underrepresented in gender and this person was underrepresented in other ways, but they need my spot, like they can have it. And I was like, no, we want you there. And I think that's the thing, is we want everyone. I think JGI was established a number of years ago because the founders felt that was a community of other underrepresented gender was something that would really improve their experience within Julia. And I think my hope would be that JGI is the first of many affinity groups to help a lot of people find community. But as we've talked about, there's not that many, like the community unfortunately is not that diverse. So there's only so many people who have the hours, have the time to put in. And I think that the model of what we saw last year at JuliaCon, which was JGI supporting and running a number of the diversity events, like the scaffolding of the diversity committee on JuliaCon is something I would love to see going forward with more groups. And something Leticia and I were brainstorming is maybe this year, similar to how we have the nighttime events, maybe we can have sort of affinity coffee hours. So
Exactly.
I would love to co-run a Pride coffee hour. That would be super fun. And start having stuff like that where folks can meet one another, because it's impossible to start something like JGI for another group if none of the folks who would want to start that group know each other. So I think that the first sort of step to building other affinity groups for other underrepresented identities is making space at places like JuliaCon for folks to get to know one another. And I think that that's something we could really focus on this year.
I also see like another thing, expanding the idea of inclusion a little bit. Also expand Julia globally by translating documentation in other languages. So there are groups that are currently doing that. I think there are groups that are translating it into Spanish, into Chinese, into other languages, and trying to bring it to other countries and other cultures as well, to trying to include different backgrounds. And I particularly try to teach Julia to the Latin community. So every year I host kind of an online course for it. So those kind of initiatives, I think, can expand the idea of inclusion and try to bring it to as many people as possible.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really changing with documentation and such. I mean, just to throw in some modern stuff into here. The stuff that's going on with LLMs is actually really kind of changing the idea of whether it's possible to translate the docs. I mean, because I remember back in 2016, I talked with Miguel a lot, and he had an idea of translating the differential equations documentation, right? But one of the things that we ran into is like, okay, the 2016 version of this package, if you translate one of the pages, how long is it actually going to stay up to date, right? And so we were
Mm-hmm.
like, we were coming up with like things that we could do, and you could actually go back and you could see the old issues on Documenter.jl. You can read the discussions, but ultimately we didn't come to doing much of it because they're just like, yeah, like, oh, don't do this tutorial yet because they're planning on rewriting it next month. Oh, don't do this tutorial yet because we plan on rewrite. It's just like, how do we keep like multiple versions in track? But it does seem like there's some actual process being made, progress being made. I think that a lot of it is kind of embracing some ideas like LLM language translations and such as part of the solution. So I do think that more inclusivity in other languages is on the horizon. I mean, we'll see how that actually goes. One of the things that I've actually seen recently quite a bit of, which another form of diversity in the community that I think that isn't talked about that much is I would almost say like socio-political, right? Because one of the things that we had some contributors to SciML that were based in Russia, and when the Ukrainian war broke out, right, we were no longer able to engage with them through the standard banking system and non-focus, and so we had to work through issues with there if they wanted to stay in with like the Julia community and like the standard way that they're getting donations and stuff, that had to be completely reworked. I'll keep everyone anonymous here, but we also had a contributor who's actually contributes quite often to some of the SciML tooling, who's based in Iran, but they build a lot of their own packages just because for certain reasons they're actually not able to do a lot of open source contributions to the other repos and such, right? But they're still like a valued member as part of the community, and they engage in certain ways. But they have mentioned before that actually we can't really contribute here. So there's a lot of impediments to people. Like I think a lot of people just say, oh, if you want to get into it, just start contributing to the package, right? But there are a lot of these other issues that get involved, and I think that as long as and you have to always find solutions and such. And I think that one of the difficulties is having people who have found a solution help someone else find that solution, right? We had someone move from St. Petersburg to Georgia, and had to work with NumFocus on this and everything. And then like the next person who comes along has to figure it out all themselves, right? And I feel like for that issue, also for the gender issues, like I think that's the issue, right? Everyone who comes up with the solution then has to, the next person who comes along with that same problem, they have to figure it out themselves unless they get someone else to help them out. And I think that maybe your organization is a nice way to pull everyone together. You find someone from the same background and just say, "Oh, how did you deal with this?" Right? And you can share that background. It sounds like that might be how Firoozeh got in with the community here, messaging Skylar, right?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I was so thankful because Firoozeh came to like all of the events last year, and I'm so excited like how much you've taken up the mantle at JGI this year. And I was just gonna say, maybe not as extreme as like the scenarios Chris was talking about, but it was also really exciting last year at JuliaCon to see how many potential JuliaCon locals we'll have, and building that sort of community as well. And I think there's going to be a couple going on this year that were formed through, maybe even that mentor program. I heard that, some people started talking about it through there, but I know at least 3 people, maybe more, were thinking of doing some JuliaCon locals this year. And I think that helps build, another form of diversity.
Oh yeah, JuliaCon locals are great. Anyone, if you tell me when your JuliaCon local is going to be, I'll try to fly out to get there. So just let me know.
So typically I ask at this point a question about what's next, what the future will look like. And I think, I guess the work of the gender inclusive group will maybe never be done. But maybe what are your personal next steps, either with respect to the community or with your professional efforts?
I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think that the work will never be done because the work is building community, and you can never, build enough community. That's never going to go out of style. But I think next steps are sort of institutionalizing a lot of the things, for me at least, that we built with JuliaCon 2024 for JuliaCon 2025 to make sure they keep happening. And fixing up some of the things we think could have improvements and breaking down those barriers within the community. And then professionally, I just started my PhD, like I mentioned. So figure out a way to bring Julia into my PhD as I work on climate solutions.
For me, I think with respect to the community, I want in the year of 2025 to kind of leverage the Julia accessibility thing that I'm working on. So kind of publish that and have it ready and start building a certain community or group around it, hopefully, because this is something that I personally really care about, and I think it's important to bring more accessibility tools for programming. And professionally, I would say I still have a few years in my PhD to go, and after that, I want to go for postdoc and become a professor eventually. So that's that's for the future. Stay. I want to stay in academia.
Yeah, and for me, unfortunately, this year I might not be at JuliaCon because that's around the time I'm hoping to defend my thesis. So
That's a reasonable alternative.
Yeah.
that's my imagination. I'm trying to push all my supervisors to agree to it. But yeah, other than that, I'm planning, since I won't be at JuliaCon, I'm planning to offer like a week-long mini course, which involves it's well, the plan is to teach software development to mathematicians because I feel a lot of underrepresented groups in my field are too scared of using computers beyond LaTeX, and that needs to change. So I am currently preparing a plan to offer it first to my own local group of diversity group, and then maybe eventually expand it to more general mathematical group. But the plan is to teach software development, but with Julia as the core language, so it's less scary.
That's cool. That sounds really exciting. So I hope all these efforts come to what's the English phrasing? Come to full fruition? No.
Fruition, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I wanted to say exactly that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to see and hear and experience more of this. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was a very insightful and highly valuable and just a big pleasure to have you. Chris, any more final words? I think.
I don't think I got any more final words for this. I think this is a good point to wrap it up. I think I'll throw it to the guests though. Does anyone else have anything else they want to just throw right in there? Any one minute quip that you want everyone to hear?
Thanks for having us. It was a very nice conversation, and I think it's good to have spaces to talk about all those topics. And I feel like here and in the Julia community in general, we have a lot of opening, and we can talk about those things very openly, which I appreciate. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll echo that. And I'll just say that if any of the listeners want to be more involved, be that by joining JGI, starting a different diversity initiative, contributing to DEI efforts at JuliaCon 2025, feel free to reach out to any of us. We can always use more hands on deck. And so, yeah, if anyone's interested, your help and perspective is very welcome.
Glad to have had you. I think that's about all. Thank you, everyone.